sex abuse and sex trafficking during this time, particularly girl children, since they tend to be the most affected. To kick us off, I wanted to share a little bit of context and background. Many of you will know that children have been the targets of physical and sexual abuse for years, decades, and some estimate that half of children are victims of sexual abuse at home. Indeed, India has actually the highest number of child victims of commercial sex trafficking, with over an estimated 500,000 victims. Like a lot of other issues, the COVID pandemic is expected to make these much worse as well. Over 32 crore students are stuck at home because of school and college closures. And while they're at home, abusers are also at home all the time. And what that means is that we're seeing a demand for pedophilic content increase online, especially as families are being pushed into extreme poverty. And the fact that families are being pushed into extreme poverty is having ramifications of children who may be trafficked. And so what this means is that children may be among the largest victims of the socioeconomic fallout of the pandemic. There's a couple of ways in which children are particularly vulnerable. One is in terms of abuse, both online and offline. What we're already seeing is that the number of calls reporting child abuse have increased by 50% within just the first 10 days of the lockdown. Of course, many more are going to be unreported because children may not have access to phones or private spaces through which they can actually make these calls. Over 90% of reported abuse actually happens by someone who is known to the child. The lockdown, of course, makes it nearly impossible for the children to stay away from these abusers and find safe spaces. And what we're seeing is that for abusers, sexual involvement with children is situational and accentuated through an increase in life stress. And of course, as we know, COVID is really driving up that stress right now. Similarly, what we're seeing is that consumption of online pornography has more than doubled. Increases in child and teen porn have been spiking in particular. This is worrisome in isolation, but really even looking more long-term, what's particularly troubling is that it starts normalizing child rape and normalizing sexual violence in the long term, and permeates offline sexual violence as well. And that leads me to the next area of potential abuse for children, which is really around trafficking. And what we know is that poverty and patriarchal norms are the largest drivers of sex trafficking amongst children. Typically what we've seen is that, when things like physical shocks and natural disasters have happened, they lead to a really steep increase in the number of children that go missing and get trapped into the trade. COVID is going to be pushing numerous families into extreme poverty. Many families who were not poor before are poor now. Families who were already poor are in dire distress. And many may actually consider trading their girl children to traffickers because of the financial situation at home. All of that coupled with the fact that it's just getting harder to report incidents and disruptions to the justice system. And the justice system is currently delayed, which is all of this is making any deterrence mechanisms that were already weak even more ineffective, especially with police actually being focused on other things right now. And so against this backdrop, I'm really privileged to have been able to bring together a panel of leading experts who've been fighting against this battle of child abuse on the front lines, of sex trafficking on the front lines, or through funding and partnerships with the government. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. First, Melissa Walavalkar. I'm sorry I can't get your last name right, Melissa. I hope you forgive me. She's the Director of Operations at International Justice Mission in Mumbai. IJM partners with the public justice system to rescue, rehabilitate, and restore victims of sex trafficking while ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable for their crimes. In her 10 years of working with IJM, Melissa has ensured over 400 survivors receive rescue, counseling, rehabilitation, and restoration services, and has worked to convict 109 perpetrators in sex trafficking cases. I'd also like to introduce Pooja Taparia. She is the founder and chief executive of Arpan. Arpan works to address the issue of child sex abuse in India. Their key project includes educating children about personal safety. And since 2006, Arpan has reached over 270,000 beneficiaries and trained 7,000 professionals in India. Dr. Nilima Mehta, she is a family counselor and psychotherapist and has done extensive work in the area of child rights, child protection, and family-based alternative care for over 40 years. She consults with several child-focused NGOs, and she was also the first chairperson of the Mumbai Child Welfare Committee, and she sat on many government review committees in the past. Nick Grono, he's the CEO of Freedom Fund, who partners with frontline organizations and community hotspots to impact the lives of the most vulnerable. In India, they've been supporting funds and efforts to end slavery in UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, and Tamil Nadu. Nick is also a board member of Girls Not Brides, the global partnership to end child marriage, and was previously the chair of the Joe Cox Foundation. And last, but certainly not least, Helen Taylor, who is the director of grant programs at the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, where she works with partners to sustainably end modern slavery by making it economically unprofitable. Helen previously conducted human rights policy advocacy at Physicians for Human Rights and the US State Department. Over the course of the session, what we hope is that we can better inform you all about the situation on the ground, which is really hard to track right now, and identify actionable measures that different players need to take to ensure that we don't unwind the years of progress that have been made on this very important topic. What I'll do is I'll spend the first 30 minutes chatting with the panelists on a few different questions. Please start sharing questions that you have for the panelists as the conversation continues, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end to talk through any questions that each of you has. So I wanted to just start off by really getting a sense of what is happening on the ground, just given that the topic of child abuse and child sex abuse and sex trafficking is actually not the thing that's hitting the headlines in the press right now. So for each of the panelists, what I'd love to just start off with is asking the question, in your line of work, what's the most important shift that you're seeing in the physical and social, emotional being of children during this time? And how are you seeing the crisis really impact the children that you're engaged with? Pooja, could I start off with you?
Hi. Well, these are unprecedented times, and life for all of us has changed. And as much as we're seeing adults feel the stress and the anxiety, children are of course absorbing it from their environment as well. So yes, children are also anxious and stressed, is a sense that we also get. We've been, connected with our children through mobile phones of their parents. So the children that we work with, whose cases were going on, and we've been connecting with them. Thankfully, so far, all the children that we've been able to speak to right now say they are safe. And I hope that that's the truth. And that's heartening to know. However, a lot of our children we're not able to contact. Either the parents are not picking up their phones, or suddenly the phones are not working or are out of network area. And so that does keep us a bit worried. I'm hoping that those children are safe as well. Historically, even when outbreaks such as the Ebola happened, we've seen that cases of sexual abuse and other forms of abuse, rose. I'm not sure it might be any different during the COVID, but I do sense that because children don't have access to frontline workers as much, because they are out of school, they don't have access to friends or other neighbors around them. I think that we might get a surge of cases much later. And this I'm saying based on data that Childline shared. There was an earlier media report that there was a huge spike of cases, but when we checked with Childline, we found that 460,000 calls were received in the first few weeks of the lockdown in India, of which only 9,385 required intervention. Of these 9,385, 20% these were 20%, and of these 0.4 to 0.5% were related to all forms of abuse. So what we really actually Childline saw was that there were not as many calls of abuse that came through. The other remaining calls were more for other interventions that were required, such as support on nutrition, medical aid, shelter, and stopping child labor. And so this is an interesting data piece, because I think it's important to put the context in place that, maybe as much of abuse that we are estimating is not maybe happening. But like I said, post-lockdown, we might have more reportage. Thing that we've seen is that based on a report by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children 2019 data, the highest number of uploads of suspected child sexual abuse material was from India as per geographical indicators related to the content. But the correlation to the pandemic cannot be established yet, is what we are hearing as well. So I think it's important to sort of pause and see how things unfold over the next few weeks as well. And as lockdown begins to open, whether the surge in cases rises or not.
Thanks, Pooja. Dr. Nilima?
Safety of children continues to remain. But there's a major paradigm shift in terms of interventions, in terms of approaches, in terms of the responses that we are making. So this paradigm shift is really moving to virtual realities and introducing the concept of e-counseling, because children need a lot of emotional support, psychosocial interventions, catharsis, ventilation, hand-holding. And I think this has brought us to learning the new technology of e-counseling and developing a cadre of people who are very, very hands-on when it comes to being with children in terms of art, music, therapy, but to do e-counseling to cope with the catharsis and ventilation and sharing of emotions. So I think one of the major paradigm shift is really looking at the approach of child protection and the intervention processes. Like she said, Pooja, unprecedented circumstances demand unusual interventions, and we do realize that the huge issues required is reaching out to people through the virtual media. So for us, the major focus has been on psychosocial emotional intervention through workshops, through training of trainers, capacity building to ensure that they understand child sexual abuse, child trafficking, vulnerability of children in terms of emotions, anger, fear, aggression, anxiety, depression, and a lot of self-help is required in terms of understanding. And lastly, we are encountering a post-trauma stress disorder situations where the uncertainty and the anxiety for future has led to children's mutism and sometimes not speaking and sharing. So we are learning new things, and the COVID-19 situation has really brought us to unlearn what we know and to relearn what we know and to respond to social realities as a need-based intervention rather than just an academic understanding. Thank you.
Thanks, Nilima. And Melissa, you tend to work with victims of sex trafficking, particularly marginalized segment of children who often get very little attention, and also there's just so little data about. What are you seeing that's happening on the ground? How are they being impacted by the crisis, and what's being done?
Yes, well, Swetha, good evening. And firstly, thank you for inviting me to share my experiences on this panel. As you know, IJM has been working for over 2 decades in the country with the central and state government and with partner organizations to bring rescue and restoration to vulnerable children. Now, I'd say with this pandemic, the situation is looking very grim for these vulnerable children and families. I do believe there is a complete breakdown in the safety and security net that is meant to keep children safe, be it in the real or the virtual world. And there's an alarming reality that we are also seeing every day. Many of our own survivors are trapped with their abusers with little recourse for help. Survivors in shelter homes believe they are trapped and there is no release for them. We have cases of survivors who have become victims of domestic violence and have had to flee their homes. There's a survivor who has even had a miscarriage on account of the violent domestic violence she's faced in her home and having to flee her home. Online child sexual exploitation has reached its peak. I also do believe there is a loss of human connection. And, some of our survivors live in remote villages. They don't even own a phone. And it has left them, to their own devices to battle these anxieties and these situations on their own. All in all, I'd say this has resulted in a range of debilitating emotions that range from fear and anxiety to depression, a sense of feeling abandoned, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. And I wanted to point out lastly that the families of these children are mostly daily wage earners who now are out of work. So therefore out of work, out of options, leading to poverty, which has, I do believe, intensified the risk. Debt bondage is spiraling. I do see a scenario of increased vulnerability and increased risk.
Who spends a lot of his time thinking about bonded labor and a lot of works with a lot of frontline organizations on the topic. Nick, what are the organizations that you're working with seeing on the ground in India?
Optimistic panel, is it? What many of the other panelists are reporting. You know, severe economic shock pushing vulnerable families into extreme poverty. And that plays out in a number of ways that contributes to increased trafficking. We're particularly concerned that children won't return to school, and particularly girls. And of course, keeping children in school is one of the most effective strategies to prevent trafficking. We're very concerned about negative coping strategies, things like increased child marriage, which often you see an upsurge at times of great stress. One of our partners has just reported to us that a 14-year-old girl attempted suicide because she was going to be married off to a 40-year-old landlord of her family's in lieu of paying rent. And we'll see a lot of that as the economic shock kind of plays out. And then there's issues around impunity. You know, government officials, police, obviously and understandably are focused on many, many challenges right now, but that means that there's less focus on tackling trafficking. Another one of our partners just reported to us that child was being trafficked from Bengal to Bihar. The police did intervene and rescued the child, but made it clear that they had no capacity to launch an investigation to pursue the trafficker, who remains at large and presumably will be out there seeking to traffic other children. So these are little stories that will be playing out on a much grander scale over the coming months, we expect, sadly.
Thanks, Nick, and that is really unfortunate. And Helen, I'd love to hear from you. How does what you're hearing from the rest of the panelists resonate or align with the GFEM's experience on the ground? You also fund a lot of organizations here in India focused on combating sex trafficking.
Thanks, Swetha. Yeah, it's really consistent. And what I'm hearing from the panelists and what's consistent with our organization's own findings is that there are really three categories. First, there's an increase in the severity of trauma experienced. So whether it's a survivor of trafficking who now is re-triggered because they're not allowed to leave their home or they're in a more dangerous situation, the trauma is worse. If you were a child before, kind of on that edge between vulnerable and not vulnerable, you've gone over that edge now. And maybe there's new abuse happening that wasn't there before. So the trauma is more severe. The quantity of children vulnerable to exploitation is growing. And then there is the normalization and expansion of online channels as a means of exploitation, particularly with child sexual assault or abuse material. And what we're finding in the US that I don't necessarily want to extrapolate, but is interesting data, is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found that there was a 220 to 320% increase in online child pornography circulated that maps directly with when lockdown happened. And so we actually are seeing a very strong correlation. We can't necessarily prove causation, but a strong correlation between people being in their homes, online, 24/7, and these increases in known child pornographic material circulating. And at the same time, the National Center also reported the same level of in-person tips for sexual abuse. So the assumption would be that if everyone is staying at home, the physical interactions would decrease, but that's not what we're finding, and that is incredibly concerning. And at the same time, state-level domestic violence institutions are hearing 0 reports of domestic violence. And so that does not point, for us, that doesn't point to a decrease. That points to victims not being able to access any channels to report. So there are significant concerns about what is going to come out when we have a fuller picture. And I like to hope for the best, also plan for the worst. So in this incomplete data environment, I think that we should all be really girding ourselves for some serious consequences.
Thanks, Helen. Also grim. And with that, what I wanted to ask, Pooja, you, Melissa, you, and Helen, you, what are you and your organizations doing to respond to these changes? And what are the gaps that you're seeing in the response today? Melissa, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, yes, Swetha. So we have responded, primarily by mobilizing a network of care. So we connected a community of passionate providers to the affected communities. We began by responding to the needs of the police and the courts. Protective equipment was a priority. And in response to specific government and partner requests from across the country, we have met the immediate need of 12,000 plus people in 60 plus districts. We have worked very closely with the labor departments to aid in the migrant labor crisis. And in fact, in this time frame, we've even conducted, supported the government to conduct rescues. Brick kiln laborers very recently, a week ago in Vizag, who had no food for days, were rescued through the support of the Odisha government in Visakhapatnam. We've also continued to support law enforcement who are working tirelessly in these lockdown days. Children have gone missing. A 19-year-old missing girl from a brick kiln in Tamil Nadu was tracked down and rescued, in Andhra Pradesh. So the police have been on it. We've been facilitating those rescue operations. And just in these 2 months, we've rescued 150 victims of trafficking. I also want to say that the commissions, that is the State Commission for Women, the National Commission for Women has highlighted the issue of increased, domestic violence. And so IGM has worked with the State Women's Commission. We have created a resource booklet on coping mechanisms for victims of abuse. We've also worked with the Child Rights Commission to create a best practice document, which has got protocols and guidance for the children in the shelter homes and also for the caregivers. And very recently, 2 days ago, the WCD and the Child Rights Commission, together we hosted a national webinar on online child sexual exploitation, and we see the unprecedented increase in CSAM, online. ICMEC and Facebook were sharing some startling data, and there are some excellent models available in the country that can be replicated in our state. Also, what we have done is focused on providing psychological aid to survivors. So we've set up online counseling helplines and support WhatsApp groups for survivors, either in the shelter homes and also those who are living independently. We've had the government to facilitate conversations with, child welfare committees across the state. Yeah, so these are some of our work in the last 2 months.
In response that you're seeing just overall in terms of helping child victims during this time?
Sorry, Swetha, you were on mute at the very beginning of that. Was that directed to?
That was still directed to Melissa. I wanted to get her take on what are the gaps in response that she's seeing on the ground.
Oh, okay, sorry, Swetha.
No problem.
Yeah, sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, so the gaps I would say is, lockdown has created delays in court trials, in all matters of casework, compensation, repatriation, rehabilitation efforts, on ground. And so, like I said, the survivors do think that they are trapped in the homes. We've seen a lot of guidelines and advisories that have been disseminated by the government, but we do think that the recipients of these guidelines and advisories should receive regular training, because there's a lot coming out, but they need to be trained on how they can apply it. I think most important is we need to strengthen the criminal justice system, in response to trafficking. And we see violence has escalated, beyond our comprehension. And while efforts are being made to rescue, we really need to focus on, proactive tracking, ending the criminal networks. And also one other gap we've noticed is, many of the survivors have limited access to technology. And so while a lot of us have managed to transition and, get online and continue to work and communicate, and like I said, stay connected, many of these survivors, many of these potential victims are locked away or are away from access to technology. And so that's a bit of a situation. Yes.
And I wanted to build on that, Melissa, which is, how do you actually essentially deter criminals during this time, right? When you have a more strained criminal justice system. And Pooja and Helen, maybe you can chat a bit to that, right? When you think about, how your organizations are responding and what you're seeing happening on the ground, what do you think is the opportunity or the challenges actually around any sort of deterrence during this stretch? Pooja, maybe we'll start with you and then jump to you, Helen.
Okay. So, well, couple of things that we started doing right from the time of the lockdown, when we started making calls to children, there were also requests about providing food, and we started grocery ration kit distribution, something Arpan probably would have not done before, but it just seems so basic, a support that we must provide. So we've gone ahead and distributed 2,000 grocery kits to families, most vulnerable families in the community, through our school partners. What we also launched was a chat box through the website, an anonymous chat box platform, as well as telecounseling for literally anybody who's feeling stressed and anxious, whether it's adults, children, and we've been counseling children and adults through the helpline, through telecounseling. We've also received calls from adult survivors of child sexual abuse who've been feeling triggered at this time. So that's been happening. We've every day we have created self-care resources on managing stress and anxiety for adults and for children as well, and even giving some parenting tips so that how can one manage this stress and manage also help children not feel stressed and anxious. So we've been regularly giving out tips. We've launched a number of awareness sessions through webinars, online platforms, on broadcasting our helpline number, as well as creating awareness on child sexual abuse, and also broadcasting the childline number so that children can call us or childline to seek help. So a lot of awareness has been happening. We've been working through our school networks also to understand how are they running online classes, and we're in the process of telling them and developing protocols of how can you run online classes in a safe manner as well. I think the gaps that I'm seeing is, the lack of access that children have to NGOs, to school staff, to teachers. And very often, these are the first respondents that children have. But that's not happening. And I think that the government and all of us NGOs need to publicize the helpline number more and encourage children to report if they are in an unsafe situation. I think that's really critical, because they could be at home and with the abuser, and the risk is very high. And so I think it's really important that they should be able to understand how can they reach out for help. I think the other thing is that because educators are also moving online, I think it's very important that they need to understand what are safe mechanisms to use and how can they keep children online safe as well. So I think it needs to be definitely coordinated efforts at all levels by everybody.
Yeah, and I would just say, in addition to the emergency response, the groceries, the food, the hygiene products, we are developing a behavior change communications campaign to raise awareness of how criminals may prey on the exacerbated vulnerabilities caused by COVID. So once the lockdown restrictions lift, of course, people will be in very desperate situations, and that may lead them to take risky choices, allow their children to engage in risky choices, or maybe people will knowingly, sell their children. And so we are planning now for a campaign in what we know are source areas to help people make decisions that would lead them, and let them know of other resources that would lead them to make decisions that protect and safeguard children. We're also doing rapid assessments to understand what the impact is on these most vulnerable populations. I mentioned these data gaps before, so we're trying to very quickly have a better understanding of that so that our interventions are appropriate. And I would say there are two key gaps for me. The first is the lack of adequate response to the online threat. Everyone is kind of behind the ball on that in every country. And the second is a little bit of a lack in medium-term planning on how to reshape systems, child protection systems, to better protect children in the long term. So we're all very fixated right now on the emergency response, and it's necessary. But I think there's been a bit of a gap on thinking 6 months from now, 8 months from now, what do we need to be planning today to make sure that when we are recovering, we're doing so responsibly. And that's why we've set up a responsible recovery fund to try to think specifically, how do we build a world where there's less exploitation and less risk for children?
And I actually want to build on that, Helen, in terms of thinking about, going beyond the emergency period and immediate world around lockdown and immediately post-lockdown, into thinking about what are those likely scenarios that may emerge, right? There's so little data, there's so little known about what's happening to especially child victims, especially those of sex trafficking. So I wanted to start with you and just ask, what do you think might be the likely scenarios over the next 6 months to 1 year that could play out? What's kind of your most optimistic scenario, and what's your potential doomsday scenario that GPEMS is preparing for?
Sure, well, I'll start with the doomsday because I could then end on an optimistic note. We don't really have to discuss it because I think what is highly possible is just a return to the situation pre-COVID, but with significantly increased vulnerability of children and new online avenues for exploitation. And that would be bad enough. We don't need to talk about more doomsday. That would be terrible in itself. Optimistically, and I would say a lot of people working in this field are probably natural optimists because you have to be. And I'm really encouraged by what I'm hearing on the panel because I think a lot of this is already started and people are, putting this into action. But I think that, if we have this massive shakeup because of the pandemic and it's revealing these cracks in society, when we actually want to rebuild, we can prevent some of this exploitation from happening. And I think that everyone from the government to service providers to individuals are really harnessing the full utility of the internet for good. So right now we are forced to adapt because we can't always meet in person. And so in our effort to make our own lives more effective and efficient, what tools can we be using to apply to this issue? And I think there are several things that need to happen in tandem, right? So we need these high quality behavior change materials that foster safe practices. They need to be developed and disseminated effectively. We need to grow digital literacy so people are empowered to keep themselves and their children safe online and offline. And then I think there is potentially the ability for artificial intelligence tools to scan and identify CSAM so that it can be removed and not further perpetrate child pornography. So those are all protective measures, but I also think that there are, these force multiplier benefits for good with broader internet outreach. For example, people in remote areas can better connect to available resources. This panel is a good example. Here I am logging in from Washington, D.C. and learning from the expertise of all my colleagues on the panel. This wouldn't have been the norm if we were able to meet in person. So I think this is already happening, but these people in remote areas and vulnerable areas should understand what laws protect them, what government schemes they're eligible for. I'd like to see an increase in digital cash transfers so that we know that money's going to the right people for the right purposes. Caretakers have clear guidance on how to report abuse. And then mental health resources for both children and for their caregivers, because this is stressful for everyone. So I think if we can collectively achieve this, we really increase accessibility to resources, and then that should decrease vulnerability of children.
Thanks, Helen. And Nick, I want to pass the same question to you. What's your doom scenario, and what's your kind of most optimistic outlook for children?
Yeah, I'm usually an optimist, as Helen points out in this space. You have to be, although I find it hard to be optimistic in terms of the impact of COVID-19. I think the best case scenario is that things just don't get significantly worse. And that depends on a vaccine be developed, being widely available. It depends on a V-shaped recovery, all in the next 12 months or so. Experts seem to think that that's unlikely. The worst case scenario we've already identified, right? Massive economic shocks, pushing vulnerable people into greater vulnerability. If you kind of apply a supply and demand analysis, we know all the drivers of slavery, and the risk is, and the likelihood is they'll be exacerbated. You know, desperately poor families will be turning to unscrupulous money lenders. Families will be taking risks when factories open up. Recruiters will be paying on desperately vulnerable families. Traffickers will be, you know, they will have a larger target market. And that is all going to lead potentially to an increase in supply. On the demand side, you have a reduction in available police resources and government resources focused on other things. So, you know, there's going to be less prosecutions, there's going to be less disincentive for traffickers. There already is very little disincentive, but what little kind of measures are in place. And it's quite distressing. I mean, we've been seeing so much progress, particularly with state governments in places like Rajasthan and Bihar and UP, in terms of focusing on particularly bonded labour issues. And we just expect that, you know, that's going to be kind of brushed aside over the coming months because there will be other priorities. And traffickers certainly won't kind of be sitting idle. They will be taking advantage of those scenarios. So it's challenging. I mean, the International Labour Organization has come out and said they expect that 400 million informal sector workers in India will be pushed into poverty. And so as you play that out, so, you know, we don't sit here and just decry how awful it is. Of course, we need to step up efforts. We need to, you know, take measures that can increase awareness in events like this. But I just struggle. I struggle, you know, things like, we all want a world that comes out of this better placed, and we all hope for that. But then I look at labour laws being suspended in a number of states, which we know will increase exploitation and risk. You know, the communities we work with have limited access to the internet and digital. So, you know, the opportunity to reach out to them is more limited. And in fact, I think that what it requires is a doubling down on things that, you know, we've seen in India in the past that are so impactful and powerful, and building of movements, building of workers groups, unions. You know, these are critically important. And as we talk about resilience, it's going to be supporting the people to build their own, and communities to build their own resilience. That's going to be a key strategy. And certainly at the Freedom Fund, you know, that we're thinking about every day.
Dr. Nilima, what about you? What are your doomsday and optimistic scenarios coming out of this?
Scenarios that are like to emerge, there are two things that we realize: that the enhanced vulnerabilities, as well as the magnitude of problem being the way it is, it's going to be a big challenge, because we are looking at the caste, class, gender. When we take the gender lens, we're looking at regions, we're looking at urban-rural migration problems. All of these are leading to the impact on children, and there are emotions of kind of helplessness and hopelessness both together. And therefore, as of now, there's a lot of gloom and doom in terms of the emotional coping with the situation, because this life-changing impact on outcomes is really linked to coping with life and livelihood. So while we do coping with life in terms of emotional support, there's a lot of vulnerability for children in residential care. We work with children in shelter homes, develop policies, programs for them, but we realize that most effective has been circle time. So there's a lot of hope that the children receive emotional support through sharing, catharsis, ventilation in circle times. And that hand holding is very critical, both in vulnerable families and as critical as in children's institutions and shelter homes. I think what is most important is the convergence. We are looking at the convergence of civil society organizations, the government efforts, and how we can work together in partnerships and collaboration and convergence, so that each one doesn't invent the wheel. You know, we kind of have shared learning, and in this learning we have role full differentiations where everybody works together. So I am a little hopeful in the sense that the future holds for us an opportunity to empower families. I think the opportunity for us to build the resilience in people in spite of all the challenges and the kind of negativity that emerges out of a crisis situation. I think this building of emotional resilience and empowerment of families is something that I'm hopeful about.
I want to use this conversation here to transition into, I think, what is an important question where, just as I think about current priorities of the government right now, right? Child abuse, child sex trafficking, victims of sex trafficking, shape or form. And so I want to ask things to do and pay attention. How can they protect the government? And so I'll start with you, Dr. Nilima, and then pass it over to Melissa and Pooja to share their thoughts.
I think the government's first attempt has been to do a national level webinar where 4,000 people were online of all the childcare institutions, all the people in the field of child protection, to bring together on a platform of sharing concerns and developing strategies for intervention. So the government intervention has been an attempt to dovetail, an attempt to empower, and attempt to capacity building of practitioners. So the practitioners are really who are living with children in vulnerable situations, organizations, civil society organizations who intervene with their group of vulnerable children, like child sexual abuse or child trafficking, child labor. There have been children who have been out of school and going into fields to work. So the government has develop different statutory bodies and their initiative in terms of how to intervene through statutory bodies, but the district child protection unit. So we have a child protection mechanism in the country. We are kind of mobilizing that from micro level to the macro level. So there is the district child protection unit working with different UNICEF support and a lot of training models, going up to statutory bodies like the National Commission for Child Protection, state commissions, child welfare committees, which are statutory bodies for children in need of care and protection, children in conflict with law. So I think the government attempt has been really intervening to strengthen systems, policies, programs, and evolve new mechanisms and new strategies for coping with the future.
Thanks, Dr. Melissa. Dr. Nilima. Melissa and Pooja, your thoughts?
Swetha, so as Dr. Nilima said, there is a lot that's being done by the government already, and IGM has been working closely with the commissions, with the WC, the DLSAs, and there's a lot of mobilization, a lot of work being done. But if you want me to articulate, some of the, the next steps or the actions that need to be prioritized by the government, and I will talk about it from a little broader lens. I'd say some things that need to be done imminently are, review whatever's existing in terms of laws and move ahead with laws that strengthen comprehensive protection for the children of our country. I'd say review the provision of current mental health facilities and services in shelter homes. IGM has set up 2 crisis centers in the state that model crisis intervention for victims of abuse. Now, this must be replicated across the country. With that, I would add, the necessity for quality counseling interventions, including trauma counseling, that are necessary to help, victims process and cope with trauma. I do think it is crucial at this time to equip and strengthen the functioning of specialized anti-human trafficking units, so that they will be vigilant and proactive in detecting and preventing child trafficking, within the borders and across borders in these, uncertain times. Another worry for us is the fact that, we've seen the migrant laborers having to return back home, right? And the strain on rural economies. So these large populations returning home with limited or no options for, livelihood. I do think it is necessary for the government to consider creating new economic opportunities, because if we do not do that, and if we do not give them viable opportunities now, you do not know whether they will want to return back to the cities. You're going to have a very dire situation of lakhs of people with no jobs, probably not wanting to return to the cities, thus putting themselves and their children at tremendous risk. We've also seen that the WCD has moved ahead with setting up child-friendly courts, and I think it's important to consider, how we can continue to sustain it, replicate child-friendly systems and processes, even within the courts and with the child welfare committees. Another point I'd like to make here is bridging the technology gap, and data and documentation being key, because in its absence, our strategies will just continue to be trial and error. So data and some evidence to back the impact of our work is very, very crucial, and I think this is the time for it. And I'd say preparing a comprehensive plan post the COVID lockdown, for when everything comes back to normal. I think we should be able to, and the government must be able to articulate that plan clearly. And finally, I'd say mobilize public-private partnership. And we have seen in our own experiences, we've been able to bring in corporate houses who are really interested in working closely with the government in sustaining all of these initiatives. And I think this is the time to raise our voices. This is the time to lean in towards everything that needs to get done to make sure we are comprehensively setting in place child protection, prioritizing it, and setting in place whatever needs to be done to protect the children of our country.
Thanks, Melissa. And Pooja, I'll hand it over to you.
My thoughts are that I think it's important to keep in mind that there are over 450 million children in this country, of which possibly over 350 to 400 million children are at home. And they are vulnerable to abuse as well, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual abuse. I think it's important that the government focuses there as well and does a campaign to talk about safety online and offline, and make children aware, make adults and parents aware about how they can play a role in protecting children from sexual abuse. It's a huge, huge number, and very often we don't think about these children who are at home and could be with their abuser at home and experiencing sexual abuse. So I'm really concerned about those children, and I don't see as much effort in creating that awareness that's required for their safety. I do think that we all need to come together to create those messages and create a campaign, and do it at a much more bigger and national level through media channels, so that children are able to understand what is appropriate, not and inappropriate, as well as, most importantly, know that who can they call for help. We recently also wrote to the Commissioner of Police in Mumbai saying we are here to help and provide counseling as well. So some of us NGOs have come together to support the police as well. So I completely agree that coordinated efforts are required, but I also do think that we need to remember that there is this big, huge, significant number of children out there at home who are at equal risk, if not more as well. And so I think it's important to think about that as well. And the other point that I'd like to make is that we are seeing increased CSAM. We are seeing increased child sexual abuse material out there. I do think that the government's response has been inadequate in that space. I definitely believe more protocols need to be put in place, and a curb needs to be absolutely put in place because of this increased CSAM that we are seeing on an ongoing basis. So I think these are some key things that need to be done.
Thanks, Pooja. And I wanted to actually hand it over to a couple of questions from the audience that build nicely upon what you just said. And this first question, I'll actually hand it over to Helen to respond. It's really around how do we, what are the tools and what are the things that organizations can do to actually fight some of the online increases of sexual abuse that are starting to happen, that we're seeing because of COVID?
Yeah, I would say that there actually are tools that exist. Our organization mapped 27 it's available on our website, www.gfems.org, but 27 online applications that have been developed or in development that could be used to combat online sexual exploitation in India. And some of those would need to be adapted. A key barrier in India is actually the law is kind of a legal gray area. There isn't a clarity under Indian law on how this can be pursued. And as a result, there's a real standstill there. So thinking creatively about how we get the necessary permissions from the Indian government to address this problem while that law needs to be revised is critical. You know, in the US, and I don't know what happens in India, but in the US, if I Google child pornography, there's a banner across the top that says child pornography is illegal. So, you know, who are we partnering with in the private sector who can create those deterrence messages, and how strict does that deterrence message need to be? Not just reminding you that it's legal. Here are the penalties that you may face. So there's a private sector piece there. And then I think, you know, what Pooja was saying about streamlining education of online safety is really critical. So right now, and you know, God bless the teachers. They are going through so much. And so I'm hesitant to put more on their plate, but equipping them to really understand how to keep the children safe, because they're the ones having contact with them on one side. And then the second side, teaching them, equipping them to identify and respond to child disclosures of abuse in a trauma-informed way is another piece that I think is really critical. So those are just some initial thoughts.
Thanks, Helen. And Nick, I wanted to pass the next question to you, which is really about a post-lockdown world, especially because of the large economic shock that families are going to face. And I think you touched upon this as you gave your introductory remarks, which was really around, look, are we going to see the rates of child marriage go up? What can be done, right? What can be done to help families, you know, be more financially resilient and essentially prevent them from selling off their children, their girl children into marriage?
But we're a big believer in investing in community resilience, and we know it works. At the Freedom Fund, we have been supporting about 40 to 50 local Indian partners over the last 4 years, with a focus on all forms of exploitation, but particularly bonded labour. And working at the community level, building community capacity does work. We did a baseline survey that showed over the last 4 years in the communities that our partners are working in, you'd seen a reduction of bonded labour, including the worst forms of child labour, from about 50% in these highly prevalent communities down to about 12% over 3 years. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have strategies that work. You know, and I know I've been a little pessimistic, but we are hearing stories of how communities can respond effectively. We work with a collective of bonded labourers in northern India that are present in about 100 villages. And when the pandemic hit, they set themselves a goal of supporting the villages they were in to avoid the use of highly exploitative loans and turning to moneylenders. And so across the communities, they pooled the grain they had to make it available to the most vulnerable families. They were lobbying local officials to identify gaps that needed to be addressed and to push for action. And they've been very successful at securing access to government benefits. And so, you know, I sometimes think that when you have a big shock, the thinking is, well, everything has to be done differently. But, you know, in a situation like this, I think a focus on community resilience, on building that kind of social capital is absolutely key and will be even more important in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Nick. And the last question that I wanted to share from the audience was really for you, Melissa. What can those of us who are at home do to help frontline workers like yourselves, frontline workers like your organization, Pooja? What can we be doing?
Swetha, I kind of missed you a little bit in between. I'm sorry, the connection is weak. Could you just repeat that?
Yeah, the last question, Melissa, is for you and Pooja, which is really, what can we do, those of us sitting at home, to be helpful to frontline organizations like yourselves during this time?
Well, I'd say, you know,
Go ahead.
Yes, I'd say, of course, get in touch with us and we'll find ways and give you options to partner with the organization. Please get in touch with IJM at ijm.org. I do think, like I said, and I mentioned earlier, that it is very, very crucial for all of us as a community of concerned, people. We all have our strengths. We're all bringing our gifts, to the table, be it from the media world, the corporate sector. All of us have the power and the potential to make a change, right? Yeah, so feel free, get in touch, and we'll work it out.
Thanks. Pooja, any thoughts from you on this?
I think all of us can play a key role in creating awareness. So, those of you who are interested to join this, please look up material on how can children be taught safety, safe touches, unsafe touches, online safety, because I think that's really critical as well. And many of us could be having our own children taking classes on Zoom or Google Hangout. Are we asking the right questions to the school administration? What precautions are you taking to make sure our children are safe? I recently read a report about how during a class, suddenly a man intervened that classroom and flashed. And this is absolutely unacceptable. So I think it's important that we also ask those questions that are required to the people that have access to our children, like schools right now, who are running classes online, to ask whether enough safety is being put in place or not. And yes, in whatever networks that you can, spread awareness about the issue. And yeah, please connect with us. We can share a lot of materials. Our website is arpan.org.in, and we'll be very happy to share that so that we can all together spread awareness and address the issue of child sexual abuse.
Thanks, Pooja. With that, I think we're running out of time. I wanted to thank Pooja, Dr. Nilima, Melissa, Helen, and Nick for sharing your valuable perspectives. What I loved about this panel was that there was such a diversity of perspectives from those who really just working day to day on the ground with children victims and survivors. Dr. Nilima, in terms of the support that you're providing. Nick and Helen, your vantage point, working with many, many organizations on the ground and taking that longer term view as well. And I think it was just really fabulous to hear from you all, both in terms of actually shedding light on a topic that very few of us can see and experience, just given how little data there is and limited access we have to the issue day to day. For you all to just share the experiences that you're seeing and experiencing right now, just to shed that light, to talk about what might the world look like as we exit the lockdown world, and really what are some things that that you're already doing, which is clearly creating such a difference for children today, and what more needs to be done from a government response perspective, but also what we as individuals can contribute. So thank you for all the hard work that you're doing. Thank you for taking the time to share your perspectives. And it's certainly a dire situation, but each of you makes me feel optimistic about how we can emerge from this situation. So thanks again.
Thanks to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you so much. And with that, folks, we are just out of time on this particular topic. We'll be switching over to a really important conversation, and one that I don't think that we talk about nearly enough, which is really around how do we engage men in the conversation around gender equality. It's come up on many panels. The last one included where someone asked, how do we bring men into this conversation? The conversation before where we talked about women's, participation in the workforce and empowerment, economic empowerment. And so I'm really pleased to transition to that in just a minute. We'll wait for 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we'll get started in that session.